Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harvey Cox, and I have the privilege of being the chairperson of this panel this afternoon. We are beginning here what we hope will be a continuous and very productive conversation among people and departments and fields that has a conversation which has not gone on as we think it should in the past. So we're initiating something. This is the first of what will be a series of conferences, we hope followed by seminars and other kinds of activities, courses perhaps, in the future. And we're bringing together here parts of the university and people from those parts of the university, including the School of Design, School of Public Health, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Divinity School, and our overall topic is urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. We think all of those belong together, and they've often been separated in our thinking and also separated frequently in the way we build our cities. We're also aware of the fact that in the next decade, 2 decades, we as a human race will have to build thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of units in new cities all around the world. And as we look out and see the way this urban construction is going on now, we are not particularly happy about the direction. And we hope we can influence that direction in a better way. So we're starting this with 3 people, all of whom, Nader is here. Hello, Nader.
Hello, Harvey. Sorry I'm late.
It's all right. Had us worried there for a moment. And I'll mention who they are, and they will then speak, each of them, starting on the right side and coming toward me, for about 15 minutes each. There'll be some interaction with them, some interaction with me, and with you. We want to invite you into this conversation, which we hope to enlarge and prolong after this. So we have here, first of all, my good friend and colleague from the Divinity School, David Carrasco, who is on our faculty and also on the Faculty of Anthropology, Faculty of Arts and Sciences. David is a scholar of the Mesoamerican cities, the great civilizations that were here before his ancestors, my ancestors, came to to impose another civilization on what was already a very thriving one. And so he knows a lot, and we want to hear something from him about those ancient cities that he studies and knows so well. He's the author of the famous book, Cities of Sacrifice, about some of those cities indeed. Now, I want to point out right away that we are not here this afternoon as antiquarians. We're not simply interested in the past for the past's sake. We want to ask some questions about the past, about these past cities that will inform us now and perhaps inform our vision for the building of future cities. Next to him sits a rather newer friend of mine, Nader Ardalan, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Harvard School of Design, and who is vastly experienced in the building of whole tracts of cities and buildings, mainly in the Middle East. I also know that Nader is a longtime participant and student of Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, and I hope he will bring some of that in too into his talk. And right next to me is my colleague Ahmed Ragab, who is the Watson Assistant Professor of Religion and Science and Culture, Religion, Science and Culture at the Divinity School, and is also a physician, by the way. He tells me he doesn't do any examinations on the spot, but if you have anything you want to consult him about, I'm sure right afterwards he'll be able to see you. So here are some of the questions I will have in mind. I have not warned these participants in advance, except just a minute ago, about this, but I thought about this afternoon, and this is what was going through my mind. Here is what some of the questions I will be thinking about as these colleagues speak. What can we learn from the cities of the past that you know about? How can we avoid their mistakes and learn from their accomplishments? Have there been cities where young and old, those of various colors and callings, could rub elbows without having their wallets lifted or their throats slit. Cities where inhabitants could savor the change of seasons without having the stars or clouds or sun and moon blotted out. Cities where the elderly, the sick, and the disabled were not hidden from view. Cities where the past spoke in monuments, museums, and parks for all to learn from. Cities where the overall design echoed a cosmic order, and sacred spaces and edifices reminded people of the transcendent dimension and of the mystery that surrounds us. Cities where people could travel without being crushed or deafened by the din. These are all questions that I have. I can't imagine that all of them would be answered by all of these colleagues, or that even all of them will answer any of them. But still, they're questions I have in mind. Cities where public buildings are welcoming and not pretentious or unapproachable. Cities where people found use for waste and refuse, do not just pile it up for future generations. Where the priceless resources of the earth were prized and not squandered. Are future cities with at least some of these features possible? Okay, first we hear then from David. Professor Carrasco.
So thank you very much, Harvey Cox, and for his colleagues who have organized this initiative to try to study and interpret the history of cities as a way of helping us imagine sustainable cities in the future. I'm trained as a historian of religions, and what I'd like to do is to combine some personal stories and also some of the scholarship that I've done to suggest a model for the interpretation of cities, at least the traditional cities, cities of the past, and to see if that model and some of the examples that I give can help our conversation along and also respond in part to some of Harvey's questions, which I've just heard. Let's get my technology here together. Okay. The Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes once wrote a great novel about Mexico City. It was entitled, ironically, Where the Air is Clear. In a crescendo of phrases, he describes the character and historical depth of Mexico City in this way. He wrote, "In Mexico City, there is never tragedy, but always outrage. City of the violated, outrage, ancient in light. Old city, cradled among birds of omen. City tempested by domes. City woven by amnesias. Bitch city, hungry city. City in the true image of gigantic heaven, incandescent prickly pear." I like the way this Mexico City has historical depth, a place of both then and now. Ancient in light and a bitch city of the 20th century when he wrote this, where people are hungry. A colonial city tempested by Catholic churches and cupolas, where violated outrages partners with amnesia. Mexico City goes way back in time in Carlos Fuentes' view. It's pre-European. It has a pre-Hispanic dimension, which is referenced in the final phrases where he uses incandescent prickly pear, where he's referring to the central image on the flag of Mexico, where a giant eagle nests on the blooming cactus in the middle of a lake. This image is the spiritual appearance of a sun god, a solar god, showing the ancient Mexicans where was the place that they were to build their city, in the true image of gigantic heaven, a capital city that was constructed to be based upon their notion of a heavenly city. I learned of Mexico City's historical depth and amnesias in two educational events. One in which, as a teenager, I felt the presence of this city in the marrow, and later, where I felt this city's absence in a great book about the urban revolution that never mentioned it once. I had, okay, it's not working here. I had what I call an Aztec moment. You know, an Aztec moment, it's not one of those senior moments where you forget something. It's a moment where I came to remember and understand something about I don't know what happened to this, about the complexity of my own identity. I first went to live in Mexico City when I was 14 years old, when my father was invited by the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana to go to Mexico City and to train Mexican coaches in preparation for the Olympic Games. School had taught me that Rome, Greece, and Egypt were the sites of urban revolutions, social and psychological and spiritual well-being. So the first time I was in Mexico City, I went to this place, this great plaza called the Zócalo of Mexico, to see what was, at that time, the National Museum. And wandering through the halls as a 14-year-old, I found myself for the first time looking at these objects that came out of this culture, out of this civilization, out of one part of my rootedness. I saw the Aztec calendar stone. I saw the jade masks of the Maya. I saw some of the monumental sculpture of gods and goddesses. I saw gold that came out of the tombs of Monte Alban. I saw pictorial manuscripts created by these people, and I was shocked because I had been raised, even as a Mexican American in this country, to value those civilizations and cities from the old world, but not really from the new world. And a sense of shame came up in me as I realized that I'd carried this attitude of the denigration of my own background, part of my own background, into Mexico City. But at the same time, as I was having this awareness of this shame, a tremendous curiosity came up in me and a kind of pride that somehow I was part of this civilization. Not that I was an Aztec, but an affirmation that I was a mixed race person, a mestizo, part Anglo, part Mexican, with Indian roots somewhere back in Mexico. And this gave me a sense that this great city was somehow associated with me, and it was something that I then went on years later to study when I went to the University of Chicago. I came to know that Mexico today had great historical depth, and that at the very place of this great plaza, which I'm sure we need to talk about when we talk about cities, right underneath it were the buildings and the bones of an earlier plaza that was still influencing daily life in Mexico. And so Carlos Fuentes came back to me then. Here I see him. I'm paying tribute to him. He passed away last year, in front of the great Aztec calendar stone, which itself speaks to some of the questions that Harvey was asking, because it's a cosmogram. It's a great statement of both mathematics and time and space, all put into a great order for people who felt a great deal of disorder in their lives. Mexico's urbanism and spirituality came to me again in an experience of absence. And that Aztec moment of the teenage years came back to me when I was entering the PhD program at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. I was studying the rise of cities, and I was mesmerized by this great and famous book by Lewis Mumford, The City in History, Its Origins, Its Transformations, and Its Prospect, which in his words, the book opens with a city that was symbolically a world and closes with a world that has become in many practical aspects a city. Latin America and Mexico were completely left out of this great book and the fame that Lewis Mumford had, for which he apologized, as well as he should have, because here he could write this book about the rise of civilizations. He not only left out Mexico, he left out Palestine, he left out many other parts of the world, saying, well, he didn't have enough experience in those areas to write this book. Mexico City, even in his time, was becoming what it is today, a generative part of the world city that he wanted to understand. But his apology was not enough for me. In my journey through the cities of the world and their struggles to include what we're calling here spirituality and well-being was greatly aided by my work at the University of Chicago with an urban ecologist named Paul Wheatley, who was also the chairman of the Committee on Social Thought. Wheatley wrote a series of magisterial books on Chinese, Japanese, Southeast Asian, Mesoamerican, and Islamic cities. And from him and the history of religions and the anthropologist under his sway, I learned 5 lessons which I want to share with you in the time I have left. The first was, and this was very impressive for me because I had, as I say, gone to Mexico at this time as a teenager with this kind of a sense of confusion about where we had to look to study civilization in cities. And one of the things that Wheatley's work showed was that there were 7 areas in the history of the globe where human beings had participated in what's called primary urban generation. That is, the creation of cities without influence from other cities, where people had come together to cooperate and to compete using their ecological complexes, all other kinds of technologies and so forth, to create what we call these cities. And they were northern China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, southwestern Nigeria is a debated case, the highlands of Peru, and Mexico. So 2 of the areas where human beings created what we call civilizations came out of the Americas, and I was certainly associated with one of them. This really interested me, and I began to work with Wheatley and others, not only in understanding the rise of civilization and cities and primary urban generation in Mexico, but to do comparative work, to try to find out what were the similarities and dissimilarities, something that's very concerning this group here, the similarities and dissimilarities in the process of primary urban generation. And here you can see an example of that in the Great Pyramid of Teotihuacan. And below, an image from a much later part of Mesoamerican history, a great painting by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, who was showing you Mexico City just at the time before the Spaniards came. You see the city in the background. What's in the foreground is a marketplace. Marketplaces are so crucial to the rise of this urban life that we live in. And you see going through the marketplace, carried above the rest of the people, the ruler Moctezuma, the Tlatoani Moctezuma, identified not only in what he's being carried in, but also by his blue diadem. So one of the first things that Wheatley showed me was that primary urban generation had really taken place only in a select areas of the globe, and then it had spread from there, and other people had taken this thing called the city and had adapted it, changed it, often using some of the same patterns of thinking that were in the primary urban generation, but also always changing it in new ways. The second thing that Wheatley taught us, for your consideration, that we're living in a time of the emergence of what he and others called an ecumenopolis. We're living through a time of major transformations in our cities and in the interrelationships between cities, which is all very important. You don't think that what goes on in Boston just goes on in Boston. Boston is tied up with Mexico City. Boston is tied up with Johannesburg. Boston is tied up with Seoul. We're tied up now with all these other cities, so when we want to think about our city, you have to realize that we're part of this worldwide network of cities. Consider this opening paragraph from Wheatley's 1965 seminal essay called City as a Symbol, where he notes that we're living at a culminating period in the history of the city, when 2 cycles of urbanization, the urban revolution, which began over 5,000 years ago, and the industrial revolution of the 18th century, were coming to an end and will merge into a universal city. He wrote, quote, "Now, when the rate of urbanization in industrial communities is tending to decline, at the same time as it's accelerating in most underdeveloped countries, we're approaching a time when not only will all human beings live in terms of the city, but urban dwellers will again be distributed more or less in accordance with the regional population densities. It seems inevitable that by the end of the 21st century, a universal city, ecumenopolis, will come to comprise a worldwide network of hierarchically ordered urban forms enclosing only such tracts of rural landscape as necessary for man's survival. Let me say, Wheatley was not necessarily happy about this, but this was the pattern that he saw. Let me add that Wheatley never suggested, in spite of his discovery of some remarkable similarities in the process of primary urban generation, never suggested that they could best be understood ahistorically, or without intensive focus on regional and local characteristics. And he would be skeptical of the idea that we should consider or cultivate the process of the erasure of national characteristics in favor of almost universal adoption of a single modern language in a single repertoire of typologies, as has been suggested by some people recently. Here you have an example just of an area in China where the idea of the ecumenopolis. The idea of the ecumenopolis is, as you'll see in a minute, not only are cities themselves places of social stratification, but there's a social stratification between cities. And they're always struggling with each other in terms of getting the upper hand in the market, in sports, in other ways between these cities. Therefore, social stratification is so important, and you can't look at these in terms of single cities anymore. They've always been interacting, and that's becoming more impressive as we move on. Thirdly, Wheatley argued that in every one of these areas of primary urban generation, while there were a complicated series of institutions interacting, the way they were integrated was through ceremonial cities, ceremonial centers in these cities. And these ceremonial centers were not just ritual places, they were also the places, and they were often very much associated with the large marketplaces. But it's really the ceremonial centers that Wheatley wanted to argue for. He said that they're the style centers of our different worlds. They set the style through the space and ceremonial dramas set in massive and local ceremonial centers. In language that Harvey Cox might like, there were ceremonial centers that created community and sometimes convivencia, this kind of convivencia. It seems to me that it's been difficult for scholars of religion and anthropology and social order to realize what urban ecologists have made clear, namely that the urban way of life was not a system contained within a city's walls or formal boundaries, but rather it spread far beyond the limits of the built form. Wheatley is persuasive when he insists that cities were the style centers. He says it is the city that has been, and to a large extent still is, the style center of the traditional world, disseminating social, political, technical, religious, and aesthetic values, and functioning as an organizing principle, conditioning the manner and quality of life in the countryside. And then he comes on hard. Those who focus their regional studies on peasant society to the exclusion of urban forms are, as I have stated elsewhere, as deluded as Plato's prisoners, or in another sense, Beckett's, who mistake the flickering shadows on a wall for reality. They too are turning their backs on the generative force of ecological transformation and seeking the causes of the great tides of social change in ripples in the beaches of history. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the Spanish soldier who fought with Cortés and indigenous allies in the siege and attack on the Aztec capital, the place of that incandescent prickly pear, did not turn his back on the style center of 16th century central Mexico. When he first saw it in 1519, he later wrote, "During the morning, we arrived at a broad causeway, and when we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land and that straight and level causeway going towards Mexico, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it, seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before, not even dreamed about." Wheatley asked, and I asked, moving now to a whole different situation, what is it that integrates people? What is it that draws them into these ceremonial centers? What is the integrating mechanism? This was Wheatley's big question. Is it warfare? Is it economy? Is it tools? Is it technology? What is it that makes people congregate and orient their bodies in such a uniform fashion in moments of high spirituality? This was his big question. And here you see an example of this. And here's still another one, where again it's a ceremonial center. This is the Great Pyramid to the feathered serpent at Chichen Itza. This is not actually a religious ritual. Well, maybe it is. This is the appearance, in the equinox of the feathered serpent coming down the stairway because of the way the sun was cast upon the stairway. And these people have all gathered, 25, 30,000 people, just to witness this today in our new age. But still, we have one of Wheatley's big points. These places have centripetal power. They have a way of magnetizing and drawing people there. And once they come to these places, their mind gets changed, their attitudes get altered. And when they go back out, something has happened to them because they have come into the ceremonial center. Here, you see it. I'll move on here because what I am trying to suggest here about these ceremonial centers is that point 4 is that what was so crucial, at least in the 7 areas of primary urban generation that Wheatley examined in his book called The Pivot of the Four Quarters, or Preliminary Inquiry into the Origins and Nature of the Ancient Chinese City, was what he called cosmomagical thinking, or what is now called cosmovision, at least in Mesoamerican studies. And cosmovision basically says that what it is that came to persuade people to participate in these great urban traditions was that its leaders claimed and persuaded other people that they had discovered an intimate parallelism between the way the heavens worked, what Wheatley calls the mathematically expressible regimes of the heavens, a parallelism between that and the biologically determined rhythms of life on Earth. They were able to put together the macrocosm and the microcosm, and they put this together in many ways. Here you see one of the codices from Mesoamerica with just such an image of the universe divided into 4 major sections. The human body is also divided into these 4 major sections, which are organized around the central section, where you see a warrior who is sacrificing himself and his blood is going out into the 4 parts of the cosmos, giving it an order. If you were to fly over the Great Pyramids of Mexico and look down on them, they were built just like this. They themselves are these 4 walls with a ceremonial center in the middle. Cities themselves were built as replicas of this cosmovision. So Wheatley's argument, and what I'm suggesting, is that in order for people to participate in this kind of effective organization of space, there had to be produced a cosmovision that somehow people internalized, even though they may have been in different locations in the social world. That effective organization of space, that cosmovision, lasted after the Aztecs themselves knew about it. This is actually a map that was painted by Cortez's cartographer, who didn't know anything about the Aztec cosmovision of the 4 quarters in the center. But in his mapping of the Aztec capital, which you see here, he did this map in order to organize the siege of the capital. He captures the fact that the city itself was a replica of this 4-quarter universe, itself divided into 4 quarters and a great ceremonial center. And each of those 4 quarters was then divided into 4 more quarters. And each of those 4 quarters were divided into 4 quarters. So they internalized this model of the universe to organize all of this activity and all of this differentiation. My final example, before turning to the last point, is that several years ago I was invited to go to Mexico because they just rediscovered this map. This is a 16th century map painted in 1542 by indigenous people who are trying to tell their story. After many of them have become Christians, they're trying to tell their pre-Columbian story. And I was asked to help decipher this. I organized a group of 15 scholars. We worked 5 years deciphering the 600 hieroglyphs on this particular manuscript. And it shows, even in all of this confusion of these objects, that regardless of what goes on, there's a moment of people emerging from the cave of creation. There is a marriage ceremony that takes place outside of the sacred road. There's a place where people are open and able to go into heaven at the sacred tree, that everything itself is organized around the city, the ceremonial center itself that's in the center of the map. This is the place to which people come, to where they're changed, and to where they go back out. And each of these cities had such a cosmovision that was produced and was replicated in many ways. And in this map, we see the center and the periphery coming together in this particular way. And even after the Spaniards come, when they come and do the conquest, they build their ceremonial centers on top of the indigenous ceremonial centers because they know that the people in those places are still oriented. Their consciousness and their minds are still oriented to these sacred shrines, to these sacred ceremonial centers, which were the center of the city. So here you see the Great Pyramid of Cholula, which was the city in the previous map, and on top of it is now the great Catholic shrine dedicated to Our Lady of the Remedies. So there is a continuity of these sacred places, these sacred centers, even after the content of the cosmovision itself has been changed. My final point, and Wheatley's final point, which creates a problem, I think, for us, is that in his view, social stratification in the past emerged from many interactive social processes, but the key transformation in human organization was in the rise of permanent social stratification, and that is the nature of cities. In other words, every city, in order to be a city, is going to be a place of unequal access to the gods and the goods. It's not a place where you're going to have this equality or this democracy. We live in a world, said Wheatley, where he wishes there was this equality. Forget about it. You're not going to have it in cities, because cities by their very nature and structure and ways of being are about social stratification. They are about class differences. Wheatley says that in China, when he saw what it took for the first cities to be created, quote, it signified for the first time in human history, the history of the world, the sundering of the populace at large from direct access to supernatural power, at the same time that it deprived the people in mass of participation in political decision-making. In other words, the populace had been alienated from the loci of both sacred and secular power. This is a profound point that perhaps we can debate, namely that social stratification or class conflict is endemic to all cityscapes, Latin American, traditional, colonial, modern, or postmodern. Let me just come to a close, pass the microphone on to someone else with this passage. In anticipation of present and the future discussions, I'd like to end with this passage from one of the great American novelists of the city, a passage that takes us back to Carlos Fuentes' Bitch City, Hungry City, city in the image of gigantic heaven. The writer is Thomas Wolfe. The novel's called Time and the River, describing his return to New York City, or is it Boston in this passage? Because he went here to Harvard and wrote this novel about his time, partly at Harvard. And this is what he says about coming back to the city after being away. And the image of the city was written on his heart, was so unbelievable that it seemed to be a fiction, a fable, some huge dream of his own dreaming, so unbelievable that he did not think he should find it when he returned, yet it was just the same as he remembered it. He found it the instant he came out of the station, the tidal swarm of faces, the brutal stupefaction of the street, the immense and arrogant blaze and sweep of the great buildings. It was fabulous and incredible, but there it was. He saw again the million faces, the faces dark and dingy and driven, harried and corrupt, the faces stamped with all the familiar markings of suspicion and mistrust, cunning, contriving, and the hard and stupid cynicism, the eyes glittering and toxic with unnatural fires of privilege and power. They were all there as he remembered them, swarming along forever on the pavements, moving in tune to that vast central energy filled with the city's life as with a general and dynamic fluid. And incredibly, these faces he'd seen 1,000,000 times now seemed to be touched by this magic of now and forever, this strange and legendary quality that the city had, and to belong themselves to something fabulous and enchanted. The people seemed to be fixed in something classic and eternal. And the magical and shining air, the strange, subtle, and enchanted weather was above them, and the buried men were strewn through the earth on which they trod, and a bracelet of great tides was flashing round them, and the enfabled rock on which they swarmed swung eastward in the marches of the sun, into eternity, and was masted like a ship with its terrific towers, and was flung like a lion's port between its tides into the very maw of the infinite, all-taking ocean, and exultancy and joy rose with a cry of triumph in his throat, because he found it wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to further conversations with my colleagues and with you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, David. That started us off. This is the first comment in the first conversation, and what we hope will be a long series of conversations. And it was done with elegance and beauty, but with a certain chilling observation. Are we really looking at the prospect of permanent class stratification? I'm glad you posed that question, because it's something we certainly have to think about. When you talk, by the way, about cities being tied with each other, I have to remind everyone here that, at least for today, Boston is not tied with New York. We're ahead by 4 games. and maybe we're still tied in other ways, but by golly, let's savor the moment when we're first. So I'll ask Nader Ardalan now to approach the podium and continue this conversation. Nader?
Thank you very much, Harvey. It's really a great pleasure to be a part of this team to present just more or less the opening salvos of what we hope will be something that you'll find valuable and that you possibly could continue in our discussions. My talk this evening is entitled Time and the Eternal, and I assume that if I do this, it'll say Reflections on Cosmogonic Places. And because this team has had a period of coming to know one another, you'll find that I'm really continuing some of the wonderful presentations that have already been made. But I'm an architect. I want you to know that for 50 years, I have deliberately searched around the world to find a place to design. That is really how I have lived. And now I've had the great pleasure of coming back to my alma mater, and for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been carrying out research about how to build more holistically sustainable places for humanity to live in. So of course this is the general area, and this is that. I also want to tell you that in 2007, I met some friends whom I had known in Boston maybe 25 years ago. And they said to me, Nader, we're organizing to have a first forum, and we're going to call it Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality. Would you be willing to give and send a paper in and pay your own way and to come together to carry on this forum? And we met in a Benedictine abbey, which has now been a habit of ours. We've now held 4 such sessions, and we will hold another one at the Gladstoneberry Benedictine Abbey in Hingham. And these sessions have now allowed this group to grow to be more than 250 people around the world, and we're also a part of the team that's supporting this work that we're doing for the urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. Okay.
That doesn't work either. Just use the arrow on the machine.
This is a setup. I want to look at a particular kind of consciousness, because the world that Davido spoke about, the world that I'm going to address, and principally while he spoke about the city, I'm going to speak about a unit of the city called architecture. And really, I'm not going to call it architecture, but I'm going to deal with place and place making. So this consciousness is a very specific consciousness that somehow we have lost, because we're now in a world of material determinism, which is rather alien to this poem. The old pond, a frog jumps in. the sound of water. Basho, 17th century. The pond, the stillness of the pond, is the eternity of existence. No motion, no time, until the drop that becomes rings that creates time. The center, stillness. The ripples, time. So this is about consciousness of timelessness at the center. And I guess when you think of maybe Rwanji, that might give a sense architectonically, landscape-wise, what this might mean. Can you hear me? Yes? My wife says you can't hear me. I want to go back to Paul Wheatley. Once upon a time, we geographers had this ridiculous argument. Was the first city a market, a storehouse, a temple, or a fort? He challenged that notion, arguing that religious and cultural factors may have been just as important as economics in turning cities into cornerstones of modern society. And then he says this wonderful thing, they were products of cosmo-magical thinking. That is, they were the precursors of what create cosmogonic places. That is, that consciousness of that which is above and that which is below are one, and they resonate with one another. So I want to begin with, and I could, you could go and give examples galore. David picked those that might have been more of his heritage. So I'm going to begin with Persepolis. Persepolis is built by Cyrus the Great and begins at 1515 BC. And it is a place that Gershman, with whom I dealt a lot with and drew his archaeological finds, Roman Gershman, the great French archaeologist, Hertzfeld, and then our own dear Dick Fry here at Harvard, felt that this place was the place dedicated to the vernal equinox, the first day of spring, which the Persians have always celebrated as Nowruz, our New Year. And that although magnetic north has shifted over a period of time, there are theories that say that if the sun rising over the Mount of Mercy, which is this mountain behind Persepolis, which originally was not called the Mount of Mercy, it was called the Mount of Mithra. And of course, as you know, Mithra, the god of light. So appropriately enough, as the sun rises above the Mount of Mithra on the vernal equinox and the light passes through this wonderful gate of all nations without casting a shadow, was the marking of the first day of spring. So this is a celebration place of all that empire to come together on the renewal of life. This renewal of life is embodied in all the symbols of this place. So here you have the lion, symbol of the sun, devouring the bull, the symbol of the moon. And what happens at the vernal equinox? The sun begins to become ascendant and night begins to recede. And from this sacrifice, from the blood spilled of this sacrifice, grows this verdant life. I don't have time to go into all this symbolism, but it really deals with these societies that saw the world out there, the world in here, and created an architecture that symbolized this kind of understanding of the order of the universe. I also want to say to you that it's interesting that the symbols also that they use are the lotus and then the cypress. I love this cypress tree. I have to say something about it, although it may take time, and help me keep time, Harvey, but I need about 20 minutes. The cypress tree is one of the few trees in the world that has both male and female within itself. Therefore, it self-replicates independently, and its beauty, therefore, is that it is free and independent. this symbol of the individual being that self-fertilizes itself is highly vital in these civilizations. I go to one that Davido mentioned, which was Mecca, only because I want to deal with the cosmogram of it. And so here at the very center, you see the Kaaba, and of course, Mecca was a pre-Islamic place of worship. I use parenthesis about 2000 because really it is sort of mythic. They say that this is the place that was found when there was the wandering of the tribes of Israel, and that you have the beginnings and the findings of these Zamzam well, and that in any case, this place becomes a place of worship. But on this northeast corner is this meteorite. That is the place where pilgrimage begins, and you go in a counterclockwise moment, and you go through it in a pace of 3 and 4, at a walking pace, at a rapid pace. All these are cosmodiagrams of the universe. And of course, the beauty is that these places are also parts of the geomancy of the world. That is, the ley lines of particular energy centers of the universe. And so Mecca has always been a thing called the navel of the universe and the navel of the world. And this mountains, very sacred to this embellishing, to this containment of the city. And today it has this feeling. Regrettably, I wish to say only the fact that that sacredness of those mountains are now being demolished. And perhaps we might have sometimes in questions to say, what do these things mean? And what does it mean that next to this place of really individual worship rises an 800-meter tower with a sign of Big Ben, and the clock is 40 meters in diameter? Jerusalem, of course, wonderful city. I'm really showing you the cities, in fact, by which I have already carried out and written books on. So at Harvard, we did the Jerusalem studios, and truly, it really is the center of the world, with all of the 3 Abrahamic faiths, and the Wailing Wall, the Holy Sepulchre, and the Dome of the Rock. 3 of the Islamic and the Christian and Judaic places of great value. Karnak, Temple of Amun, 3002 BC, of course, a sacred place on the east side of the Nile River. And the red line, well, it's an axis. People have been building on this axis. So the temple is actually built of many, many parts being built over the years, and would have continued to the right to the temple of Amun-Hotep. But really the reason I say this to you is 1,500 years, 700 years later, comes from this axis, and here are those columns of this incredible place in Karnak. But on the same axis, on the other side of the Nile River, comes the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, the queen of Egypt in this period of time. And so you see how the sacred axis can provoke and move and go into the mountain. And actually, this is a brilliant sense of going back into the earth, into the very earth from which we all are born. So this powerful line, please, let's keep this idea. The spiritual axis is an important axis of what cosmogonic architecture is about. Now we go to another part of the world. My wife and I traveled with His Highness the Aga Khan, ironically enough, in May of 1979, to this beautiful place called Bali. And you know, there is Mount Agun, which is about 3,000 meters above ground. And next to this is really the most holy of the temples, Besaki Temple. And of course, it's all tiered with rice paddies that are terracing up. This is the lifeblood of what keeps people going. And from this rice stalks, etc., is what is built on this hilltop, on this mountaintop temple, the most holy of their temples, and all of these, of course, with the symbolism of numbers associated with them. But the most beautiful thing is that this place is a place of, again, a ritual worship and renewal. And when we were there, it was Eka Gasa Rudra. Every 100 years, this ceremony begins by 2 pairs of everything, like Noah's Ark, being taken ceremoniously from the ground to the top of the mountain. Why the top of the mountain? Because that is the place of the gods. And then one of these is thrown into the volcano of the great mountain, and the other pair is brought down to the sea and given as offering to the water, where the demon lives. So, gods above, demons below, man, human being, to keep the balance in between. Old ship meeting house. Wow, what a big change. But not really. Because people who came to this new world were also looking for that shining city on the hill. They found it in clusters. There was, of course, the Boston Harbor cluster with Beacon Hill. There was the Dorchester cluster, and then there was the Hingham cluster. And here, the oldest existing meeting house church in 1681, a great, great cube with the ontological axis provoking the heavens. But curious enough, as things transform, so here's the interior, and then I'm going to show you the plan of this great wooden interior and the great wooden arches that hold this 2-story space. But in plan, it's very interesting. As you know, a Christian place of worship would have principally the altar toward the east, toward the rising sun, toward the rising Christ, which is actually where, I don't know, is there a pointer in this guy? No pointer? Yes, pointer? No pointer. Okay. Anyway, so it should have been here, and it was here. And then around the 18th century,
I did.
I love you. You're always the savior with your life. And so then it moved to here, to the north. And then, of course, if you read this plan, all the society is organized very carefully. The elders are sitting here. Yeah? And then the women are here, the men are here, the children are here. And so all society comes to this place, not necessarily as a ecumenical place of ordering, but a social ordering. And so this really now today exists as a wonderful liberal Unitarian church in Hingham, where actually we will also nearby have our ceremonies and our lectures. Oh boy, Mission Church, going fast. So I'm not even going to say any more than just to show you, but because Rancho dos Tajos so beautifully then felt in this environment of the great Black Hills, caught by Georgia O'Keeffe. But look at that plan, about 25 feet, 80 feet, almost like a 1-to-3 plan, and then up so, gone fast. So Thomas Merton sums up these wonderfully beautifully. We find ourselves to be most truly human when we are raised to the level of the divine. Thus, in a single act, we accomplish the double movement of entering into ourselves and going out of ourselves, which brings us back to the paradisical state for which we were originally created. Where is this place? It is not a place, it is God. This aspect that of this double movement within the cosmogram, you can also sense your place in the universe. Well, this diagram of death and rebirth, constantly occurring within all of these societies that we might be referring to, almost like breathing in, breathing out, the constant rhythm of life and rebirth. And I'm going to, I guess, have to pretty well quickly close because I was going to do you a case study about Esfahan, but I'll read the poem and then go through quickly the images. 'Twas a fair orchard full of trees, fruit, vines, and greenery. A Sufi there sat with eyes closed, his head upon his knee, sunk deep in meditation mystical. Why, asked another, dost thou not behold the signs of God, the merciful, displayed around thee, which he bids us to contemplate? The signs, he replied, I hold within. Without is naught but symbols of the signs. Rumi, drawing of the 16th century from our museum. And this really deals with an interesting idea that through all these different places that one travels, I find more and more that there is such kindred sense, that there is a hidden and there is a manifest. There is a micro and there's a macro. And that within this micro and macro, there is this possibility that, fortunately, this diagram has come on and says this. And so it's a very lovely time to stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nader, for that trip around the world and through the ages. You've also posed a question for us, I think, just as David did. When David spoke about one ecumenopolis, one world city, and you talked about a cosmovision with its central location, its central cosmovision location, and the navel of the world, I keep reminding myself that we live in a world in which there seem to be a lot of navels now. Various religions that center their cosmovision on various places in the world, and some of those religions get along well with each other, and alas, some of them are at each other's throats at this point. So can we really have an ecumenopolis, a world city which has this cosmovision, unless we work out this issue of how we in these different traditions understand each other and get along with each other? And I think you've made one suggestion for how we do that, but I think it lies before us as one of the things we have to deal with in our conversations. So now, Ahmed, we're asking you to come to the podium and make your own observations, and then we'll go on from there.
Thank you, Harvey. Many thanks to all my colleagues in organizing this. And these are tough acts to follow. So I don't have anything to show you. So today I'm going to talk about a particular part of the medieval city and the early modern city, which is the hospital. And I will start with an important story that keeps repeating a lot in many biographies of medieval physicians in the Islamic world. And this story is about the moment of choosing a site to build a hospital. The story goes that a famous physician was asked to choose a site, or to help choose a site to build a hospital in Baghdad. And what he wanted to do is to choose the best place possible for this form of practice. What he did was that he asked his servants and his aides to take pieces of meat and hang them around the city and wait and observe these pieces of meat as they rot. And the place where the meat rots last will be the best place for the hospital to be built. The idea is based on the notion of miasms, which is an important part of the understanding of, or the medical theory that dominated this particular world, the Galenic medical theory. The idea is our diseases are caused by imbalances in our humors, and these imbalances in our humors can be caused in one way or another by problems in the miasms, which are the types of air around us. And in many cases, it's also built on an understanding that humans are essentially animals, and that we are largely made of the exact same matter that all other animals are made of. And therefore, if we take pieces of meat and wait for them to rot, the place where the meat will rot last will be the place with best miasms, and therefore will be the best place to build a hospital. This story never happened. And actually, the historians who kept saying or kept repeating this story always said that this story never happened. There's absolutely no evidence it ever happened. More importantly, the protagonist of the story, Al-Razi, is a very famous physician who was never involved with actually building a Bimaristan or a hospital. The hospital which is supposedly the one that people are trying to build is usually Al-Bimaristan Al-Adudi, which was built in Baghdad about half a century after Razi's death. So it was really a story that brought the most famous physician in a relationship with choosing the site for the most famous hospital, and it was not true. However, it was always reported over and over again by all these historians, particularly the historians who were interested in the lives and the works of physicians. The story was in fact a dream of all these physicians of the moment when they get the chance to choose where the hospital should be built. They kept repeating it and saying it's wrong because it is not about the historical accuracy of the story. They were not interested in that. Everyone knew it's a myth, but they wanted everyone who reads to know that this is really the right way to build a hospital. You choose the place where it is the best for all these patients to be in. But this is not the way hospitals were built, and this is not the way sites of hospitals were built. There were other ways. One of these ways, for instance, is to choose the places where you are closest to your patients. And in these hospitals, all of which are charitable organizations, which are essentially were made and created in order to care for the poor, the patient, the sick poor, there was the idea of building hospitals close to the poor. In fact, we see stories of physicians who would take some of their students, take a cabinet of medicines, and go to suburbs that are known to be very poor and essentially set up an impromptu hospital there and practice until these people are cured. Not only that, we have accounts as well of physicians who take their students and their colleagues and go to prisons in order to serve people in the prison, setting up essentially a hospital in these prisons. The idea is that these poor are the ones who the hospital wants to serve, and in order to provide this best service, you take the hospital to them. However, hospitals were not built like that either. These are very rare examples. Normally, examples of clinics, small practices that are taken to places, but hospitals, the big hospitals of the medieval world, were not built close to the patients, were not built close to the place where the best medical practice could be made. They were built as monuments for particular founders and as monuments for particular moments in history. The hospitals were largely built in the center of the city. They were built in the center of the city not because the poorest lived there. On the contrary, the poorest lived far away outside the city. It was not because this is the best place where you can build something. On the contrary, this is probably the lowest place in the city being in many cases surrounded by mountains, for instance, and therefore this is actually the worst airs in the city could be in the center. But it is built there because building a monument is in itself an act of violence and violation. It's an act that transforms the structure of the city by erasing something and building something in its place. And by this act of erasure and recreation of a particular part of the city, there is a new ritual act of remembrance that gets to be created around the monument. The monument stands as a site for people to remember. And the people who are supposed to remember are the ones who matter the most, the ones who live in the center of the city. These are the ones who are supposed to remember those who build the hospitals. And those who built the hospitals had in mind the idea of building monuments that would not only carry their names for centuries after centuries, but more importantly, that would interrupt, that would stop people. And because this act of interruption would make people think. But in doing so, they ended up not only erasing one monument and building one another. And of course, when you have cities, when you have very complex and cities with very long history, where you want to build a hospital, there's really no empty lot there. You have to demolish something. You have to remove a building and build your hospital in its place. And the choice of what to remove and where to build the hospital is not really, again, a choice about the poor or a choice about medicine, but it's really a choice about what to forget and what to remember. We want to forget something. We erase something and build something else that is built for us to remember. But then, as they do that, something else emerges in this new city. It becomes a new city by this act. And this new city starts to acquire a different character because there is different movement. Now suddenly all these people who used to stay outside, sick, taken care of probably by friends, neighbors, or family, or sometimes by absolutely no one, left outside, now they make their journey in. The city changes because the patterns of movement where people know the city start to change. Cities are not necessarily known when we look at them from the air because people didn't look at their cities from the top. They looked at their cities from the streets. And the city changes by the manner in which people change their style of movement. They move differently. They go to different places. The hospital in the center of the city becomes a very significant part of the city because essentially it changes everything. New people are coming, new faces, new patterns, new habits of worship. All these things are coming inside, in many cases violating the very rich center of the city where the hospital was built in order for these builders to be, or these founders to be remembered. But as the hospital starts to build or is being built inside the city, it's not only something that changes the city, but it's the product of the city itself. Throughout my study of history of hospitals, that extended really, I studied hospitals around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East for over quite a span of time. And the most important thing about most of these hospitals in late antiquity and in the medieval world is that they are largely urban institutions. There are no hospitals in villages. They just don't exist. They are urban institutions. Why? Because in many cases they are built for a specific audience that is the product of the city. As David was explaining, the idea of the city creating these stratifications, the presence of the new urban poor that is created in the making of the city, these are the subjects of the hospital. These are the people who the hospital has to function on in order to be an effective institution and in order for the hospital to actually perform its role, its medical role, its charitable role, and its role as a monument. The urban poor is a specific type of poor. It's a poor that can be seen as different from the rest. A poor that is necessarily divorced and removed from longer and deeper family relations that existed in the rural community. The city is not organized around families. At least the medieval city in the Middle East is not organized around families. It is organized around professions. People live in a particular place because they work or they do something in particular. And depending on the profitability of what they do, the site that they live in gets to be closer or removed away from the center, and it gets to be richer or poorer. People are organized around a different type of belonging that makes them attached to one another away from older and traditional ways of belonging that link them together, like, for instance, family structures. Now, the urban poor are the ones who live far removed from the center, the ones who occupy positions and jobs that are very much precarious. They can lose their jobs very easily. They sell very simple things that a lot of people can just live without. They do not have these major and most important jobs. They are the ones who are also subject to a lot of epidemics, and they are the ones who will suffer first in cases of famines. And why would they suffer in cases of epidemics before anyone else? Because as the city is making them through recreating their relationships to one another, it is also making their susceptibility to diseases by creating better water and better sewage in the center and worse services in the periphery. The city is making the poor, and in many ways making the poor poorer and making the poor more dependent on the existence of the charitable organizations that come to be really what define the city. At least the medieval city. The medieval city here becomes centered around these hospitals, these water fountains, these kitchens, public kitchens, these hostels that host people. All these sites become at the center of the city, essentially, and through movement, bringing the entire city together. by bringing and attracting all these people in the periphery to the center. As cities develop, they also become places for visitation. People visit cities. And as people visit cities, cities come to form networks. You go to places to learn, or you go to worship, you go for pilgrimages, or you go for trade, all sorts of purposes that connect people from one city to another and that allow or force people to move from one place to another. But as you move from one place to another, you get essentially to be in this new category that is disconnected from family, that requires care, that is also poor. Another type of urban poor that is based on the travel and the spread of travel. The centers of the city and these charitable organizations, including the hospital, are not only connecting every single city in its own different parts, but they become knots of contact that connect all these different cities into a network of connections. Because people travel to these places. Because when you travel, you'll go to the charitable kitchen and you'll go to the charitable hospital, and in many cases, you will end up inside the hospital. And in that case, the hospital, the kitchen, the charitable organizations, many of which were organized around religious organizations, all these hospitals become in many ways sites for this city to come together and for all these networks of cities to come together. But also because of this form of network and connection, we find a stratification of cities, again, as David explained. The idea that not all cities have similar hospitals, not all cities have similar charitable organizations, not all cities are able to host and to serve its own poor. In many cases, you can leave your own city and go to another place to attend these particular organizations, which become essentially a way of showing or of symbolizing how a particular city is bigger, richer, and more important than others. There's another interesting example of hospitals in the medieval world. And this example is rooted not only in the urban structure, not necessarily in the urban structure, but rather in another form of structure and of essentially belonging to something that existed across different structures. It's the pilgrimage hospital. The most famous of these pilgrimage hospitals are the hospitals that are built by the Hospitaller order during the medieval period. The whole idea of building hospitals everywhere, of providing hospitality to pilgrims, is that you actually trace the pilgrimage route and you put these hospitals and center on it. It's for the service of the pilgrim. But people working in these hospitals are always surprised by something very interesting, which is all these hospitals or houses of the Hospitaller order, very small, but still located very far away from anything. They are not in any pilgrimage route. They are just somewhere in the middle of almost nowhere, just situated there, where a couple of brothers would stay and wait for pilgrims to come. But pilgrims never come, because no one comes to that place. People take the major routes. Why would you build a place here? The pilgrim that they are looking for is not the real one. It's a potential pilgrim. The existence of the route is what is important. And the hospital and the house become the place to define the existence of the route. They build hospitals in places where some pilgrim one day could pass. There is always the justification of building a pilgrimage house anywhere. It doesn't matter, because anywhere could, at one point in time, fall on a pilgrimage route. The hospitals of the Hospitaller order, which is again the largest and most significant example, but only one among many other examples, were forming together a network that would really survey a space for pilgrims to move, not necessarily the real pilgrims that we can count and we can see coming to Jerusalem, but in many cases, imagined pilgrims, potential pilgrims, that would one day make their way to these places. This is not an isolated phenomenon. Muslim powers were also building a lot of these houses and hospitals along the route to Mecca. The Byzantines were building houses that would lead to Jerusalem but also lead to Constantinople. This is a very repetitive phenomenon. And in all these cases, the idea was to mark the route with the hospital, to mark the route with these charitable institutions that would allow people to move from one place to another, but would also recognize how these people who are moving are now becoming part of an imagined community of urban poor. They look exactly like your urban poor. They don't have families. They don't have stable jobs. They actually have very little savings that could run away, that could run out. And in many cases, they are always susceptible to the dangers of the road and to the dangers of the city. The charitable institutions were born inside the urban settlement, in a way expressing the new citizenship or belonging to a city that is made not along family or tribal connections, but along largely a lot of economic and spiritual presence. Students, pilgrims, and workers were there in the city. And they were there because they were doing something. Now, in the vast majority of cases, these things that they were doing never ended. And the student's trip to a particular city came to be a lifetime migration. And this student would just spend the rest of his or her life in this new place. The idea is that these people who came to the urban center and created the social stratification of the urban center were now centered around a new place inside the city that housed all these charitable organizations that really not only catered to the poor, but also created them. Created them by defining the category of the deserving poor as opposed to the undeserving poor, by noticing who really deserves the charity and who does not. And in doing that, there is another layer of stratification, another layer that would send some people away. There is also other layers that are related, for instance, to religions, religious affiliations, sometimes to ethnicities that would allow some people into the charitable institution and others who are equally poor outside. They cannot be admitted. That charitable organization at the center of this particular medieval, late antique and medieval city was the nerve of this new city. And at the same time, it was making the city as it progresses. And when you take these hospitals and you spread them everywhere into pilgrimage routes, you're really creating more and more a larger image of this urban population that is devastated by its removal from larger and deeper traditional connections to other people and creating a sort of a larger global community of travelers or of pilgrims. None of them has any connection with one another except by the purpose of their particular trip. And in many cases, and throughout the history of these charitable institutions, the hospital being one example of them, we see how these cities come to create their own stratification by the size, the importance, and the ability of their institutions to survive over a longer time. I will stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, I began by pointing out that this is a conversation under the general rubric of urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. And you can see how all three of these streams of thought and endeavor have played into this afternoon's enormously rich and informative discussion. And also how the city seems to be the focus for each of them. So I think we've hit on something, and I think the conversation was well begun. Now, I want to put a couple questions that came to my mind to the panel, and then perhaps have you, or certainly have you, put any questions you'd like. A couple of them are rather troubling. Back to what both Ahmed and David said, are we really fated for stratification for as long as time endures? If we have cities, do we have classes? If we have cities, do we have stratification among and between cities? If we have classes, surely we'll have class conflict. Is this something we are sentenced to in a way, or is there some way we can outgrow or avoid this? My second question is, have we, as I was listening, especially here both to David and to Nader, the beautiful sense of this cosmovision that unified people and unified people with the heavens and with the past and with the present. Have we lost that? In modern technological society, have we lost something that's irreplaceable? Do we talk about this only in terms of nostalgia? Or is there any way we can reclaim this as a part of what it means to be human beings. So I think I'll ask either, maybe starting for a moment with David, and then Nader or Ahmed to respond to those questions. And please make your responses informative and short and brilliant. And then we can go on to those in the audience.
Well, in terms, just real quickly, I'll go ahead. Yeah, in terms of the model that I presented that was developed by these urban geographers, they would say, we are sentenced to this, that this is what is the nature of cities. This is what we are going to have to struggle with. This is what, the protests have to, the movements are going to have to always deal with this social stratification, because the city by its very nature is a pyramidal society. Even when you have these revolutions and these transformations, this social stratification comes back into being. In terms of the second question of the nostalgia, Wheatley also wrote an essay called The Suspended Pelt, Reflections on a Discarded Model, where he felt that the model of cosmovision was being discarded by new developments in urban life. But that's not to say that there aren't things to replace it that can be equally impressive. Perhaps the movements that we see going on now about sustainable cities and the green movement is a way to try to recover some notion of cosmovision. So that would be my quick and unbrilliant responses.
No, that was entirely brilliant, David. Nader?
Yeah, no, very nice questions.
They're not very nice questions. They're both kind of sharp.
They're right to it. But let's go to how perhaps Abraham Maslow answers this, or how Erik Erikson answers this. And both of these people look at consciousness growing as a series of steps. So Maslow goes from the need of the gut. I don't know if this is on or not, but we're all here.
We can hear you.
Yeah? Yeah, so it goes from the bottom of the pyramid with satisfying your physical gut needs to self-actualization. And Erikson goes through his 8 life stages, and I guess some of us are at that despair and balance stage, and others are at this trust stage. So I think it's the natural phenomena of human existence that you go through these layers of psychological consciousness. And so some of these are creating your stratification, whether you like it or not. Now, your other aspect about the cosmovision, well, I mean, I know when we were just sort of here finishing our masters in 1972 or so, hot summer, and there was this wonderful man orbiting around the Earth. And then after a little while, one of the astronauts produced that beautiful picture of the blue marble, the blue Earth. And that said the one Earth. So no, I think that the issue of consciousness of the cosmos and our place in the cosmos, and particularly the most recent imaging that is coming out of Switzerland of the first 300 million years of the universe as it's caught out in space by little dots, from the Big Bang out where the little particles. I think the information is out there. It's just that it doesn't matter, apparently, to our daily lives too much. And we don't organize ourselves through it. Whereas the worldview of some of the things we showed were very conscious. You design cities, towns, architecture in your life through certain given worldviews about the epistemology of existence. Whereas today, our existence is easy. You turn on the television, it tells you buy stock, and so you buy, and that's it. You live a material life, you're removed from the cosmos.
Okay, get us out of this, Ahmed.
I'm afraid I can't, but I'll try. So to go back to the question of stratification, I think what I described was a particular type of geography that was based on one hand on this stratification, but that also enforced the stratification. The flip side to the story that I was trying to tell is that there is another geography of resistance, and that this is not a one-way relationship. that these marginalized who are brought inside and stylized and organized by charitable organizations are also the same people who will come to cause a lot of the resistance inside the city. Resistance to this particular, to a specific social, political, religious order, and lead different types of reimagining of the city. Now, what happens after every episode of resistance is different. But the story is always about this. It's a story, in my opinion, of continuous dialectic between these people, continuous relationships of power, of stratification, and also of resistance to these things. And I think, in my opinion, although it doesn't give a straightforward answer to are we destined or sentenced to that, I think we are sentenced to dynamism, and that's probably a good thing.
Well, thank you. And now it's your turn, folks, so please let me know some way or another if you'd like to pose a question. Jack?
So I've had the pleasure in the last couple of years of traveling in the Middle East with Nader. And
Can you hear Jack Spengler?
so I had the privilege of traveling with Nader throughout the Middle East on some projects that happened.
A faculty member at the School of Public Health.
But something you said makes me want to ask you and other panelists this question. You talked about the macro, the micro, the inward looking, the outward looking, the reflection of self and the giving of self. In all your travels, in all your places, each one of you, have you felt particularly centered in a place? Did it all come together for you in a sense, that you can say, yes, this entity, this place really has that resonance for me?
I was asked to participate in this panel only 3 days or 2 days ago. And so
You must be feeling very centered, though, by now.
I feel very centered. So whatever I chose that you saw were places that I've been and that have moved me. And that's what I shared with you. And every one of those places, really, I felt centered because there was something there. From a very long time ago, people have looked to these places, such as Jerusalem, such as Mecca, such as this top of this mountain in Bali, or this little place in Taos that has driven, or Georgia O'Keeffe to keep drawing and drawing this place, or Ansel Adams to photograph it. There is an authenticness, there's an authenticity, and I think it's this authenticity that gives me the sense of centeredness.
I wonder if in the evolution of consciousness that you've mentioned, Nader, in relation to the city, we are now evolving into a species in which we can have a number of different centers in which we can feel centered. Maybe the previous model of the unicentric person who needed a particular center to go repair to is evolving away, and we now we're developing into people that have multiple ways in which we can feel at home or centered. Your question is a very good one, Jack, and I think about experience of myself standing, for example, in the cathedral at Chartres and saying, yeah. But then a couple years later, standing in Kyoto, Japan, and saying, yeah, this is really a center. And 2 or 3 other places that I could mention, I think. Now, does that mean that I am a dismembered person? I hope not. I hope it means that as the world is becoming an ecumenopolis, and we get to know and learn from each other, we can develop this kind of, we can emerge with this kind of person. Yeah, David?
Well, just in terms of this question, which is quite interesting, I remember once talking with Toni Morrison, and she was saying that it was really interesting to her that whenever she went to her mother's house, she always slept better. When I had my children when I was younger, I was a single parent, I would take them to my parents' house, which was not a calm house. But taking my children there, I would always sleep better there. So there was a place where I felt centered for a time.
When I had young children, I didn't sleep at all, David.
Just to follow on quick on there, I don't think that there's a discrepancy, multiplicity within unity. unity within multiplicity. It is within the individual who has a sense of center, and therefore he can then recognize and resonate with such centers anywhere. The problem in our life is most of our places of gathering have no spiritual center that has the depth to resonate with. And so there you are. And when you find a place, I don't know, Karnak or whatever, that has this quality, or this little meeting house in Hingham, you resonate with it. So I think you carry your centeredness with you, but you've got to develop that.
Ahmed?
I think I agree more with what you mentioned. I think we are growing to be more multi-centered, and there are different places express different types of human experience that can resonate with our own experiences and shape our own experiences in many ways.
So the question that suggests itself to me at this point is, then how do we nurture people who can have a sense of centeredness when they get there? And how do we nurture people who can have a multiple sense of centeredness being available? Yes, who was it? Yeah.
I don't know if this means anything.
We've been getting along without it, but yeah, David?
He had a question, I gave it to him.
Oh, you had a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Harvey, this
I don't need a microphone.
right up here, yeah.
Let's have you first and then
Go
Dan.
up here on the left, this gentleman.
I,
will wait.
I arrived a little late, so I don't know if anybody had this conversation. I drove in here from Lowell, and found out about this at the last minute, so I came. But I'm surprised that I'm not hearing any conversation about the speed with which one moves through space. You're talking about centers, and what's destroyed our sense of the value of places and centers as we imagine them in space is the automobile, by far the most destructive force against the spiritual nature of space that you're discussing today. If you go through New England and you look at old houses, like pre-18th century houses, like 16th century, 17th century houses, you notice they don't even face the road. They face the center of the city. You go up to the top of Winter Hill and you see a pre-1700s house, and it's facing down the hill to Boston. And you see this all over New England. You walk up by Mount Auburn Hospital and you see the old granite marker of the city line, and it's not made for obviously it's not made for somebody going by in a car, but it's got the C for Cambridge carved on the Cambridge side, and the W for Watertown carved on the Watertown side. This marker, this can only be experienced at a walking speed.
Okay, I guess I get your question.
So the point is, if you get rid of cars, everything that you people are afraid of happening, human nature will reassert itself, and we will live in space as we once did.
Okay, yeah, we have, there are other people expecting to use this room. If we ever leave, maybe we won't. There was a question back there, yes.
Sorry, yes, Professor Weiskell has a question, and unfortunately, there's also an exam in the room at 7, so we'll need to
Yes, I
leave in
just
about
mentioned that.
5 minutes, so
We'll be out of here in 5 minutes, unless we want to stay and take the exam. What subject is it?
Here's a simple question. We've been focusing on centers and cities and the like, mainly in the midst of continental space. Yet since 1492, most cities have grown up on the peripheries of continents, and in some sense have been peripheral to religious belief as well. That is to say, they're port cities. This puts them in a very precarious position with rising sea level. In America alone, 180 cities are going to be threatened by sea level rise by the end of this century. In the rest of the world, it's much worse. 6 million people are estimated to be displaced by the middle part of the century in the area of Egypt known as the Alexandria Plain. Cities are going to come to mean something very different very quickly. I'm wondering if any of you are reflecting on themes that this might raise in reference to spirituality, centeredness, class conflict, or other themes you've mentioned.
Well, I think that, the focus of tonight was really more cities of the past. But this is a very good question, I think, about developments that maybe we should pick up when we're talking about the future. Just to
Yeah, this
answer
gives
the
me a
question.
chance also then, Julie, Julie Africa, could you come here, please? To remind you again that this is the first in a series of these kinds of conversations that will be taking place here. And I'm going to ask Julie Africa, who's been working so closely with us and done such a wonderful job, to remind us of when they are and what they're about. Can you do that?
This information is also available on the Urbanism, Spirituality, and Wellness Initiative's website, which is www.hds.harvard.edu/USW. The next program is on May 2nd from 5:15 to 6:45 in this same location. Similar format dealing with contemporary cities. Our two speakers, Professor Raul Malhotra, who's the chair of the Urban Planning Department at the Graduate School of Design, will be speaking with Dick Jackson, who's the chair of the Environmental Health Department at UCLA. And on June 6th and 7th, we'll have a program at Hingham, in Hingham at Glastonbury Abbey, as mentioned by Nader Ardalan, followed by a program on June 8th at the Harvard School of Design, on the Harvard Divinity School campus in the Sperry Room. It's an all-day seminar with multiple speakers speaking to future urbanisms. So if this topic interests you, we hope you'll join us again. Thank you.
Thank you. So you see our scheme. We're thinking about the past a little bit today, what it could teach us about the future. We're going to focus on the future, or on the present, what we're doing now that's wrong, what we're doing now that might be right, and then we'll be talking about the future. Yes.
Maybe one more quick question from our colleague. He was ready to go. At least we can take it with us.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you one to take with you. It has two parts. First, if stratification is endemic to cities, should we be talking about better cities, or should we be talking about entirely new ways of allowing 10 billion people to share this planet, perhaps ways that involve, polycentric networks rather than pyramidal cities? The second, though, is points in the opposite direction. I wonder if, along with the stratification, there might also be a decline in violence with urbanization. If Steven Pinker's numbers are right, increasing urbanization has correlated with decreasing violence over the course of human history. So there might be something in bringing diverse people together that limits violence, and we would want to certainly save that.
Yeah, thanks. So we will take that question with us. These are big, big questions, and you've been a wonderfully attentive audience, and I want to especially thank our panel for launching us.